Okay, that's good. Well, thank you for coming out on this horrible cold day. This morning, when you opened your back door, you had no doubt that Antarctica was down the road. At least I suspect that was the case. It certainly was with me. But you know, Tasmania's interest in Antarctica goes back a long, long, long way. It goes back to the days of Gondwana and back to the time when Tasmania, which you'll see, and I'm afraid I haven't got a pointer here, I hope there was one, but you'll see Tasmania right at the top of the map, above where I'm pointing. Tasmania was originally connected to that little dark red knob where it says Ross. It says the Ross dependency. That's where Tasmania has been for a long, long time. And I think it very often wants to remind us that that's really where it belongs. Now, this is an odd map, and I'm going to be talking about it a little bit later because it's a very, very significant and very important map. But I want to just point out where one or two places are, particularly for those who haven't been to Antarctica or can't pick up anywhere that they recognize on this map. Indeed, you'll see much of the outline is not yet fully surveyed. But the Ross Sea is in this great arc here to the right, the Ross dependency, it says. That is now currently the New Zealand sector. The Australian Antarctic sector extends from the upper line right round to that line heading off to 11 o'clock, as it were. All of that is the Australian Antarctic sector, with the exception of the only claim which in 1939 had been agreed, and that was the French sector, Adélie-land, and you can just read the words Adélie-land there. I just want to point out where a couple of other important places are that you may or may not know. And working from the center of Antarctica as if it were the center of the clock, at about 1 o'clock or 1:30, maybe even 2 o'clock, is Casey Station, one of Australia's 3 Antarctic stations. That's rawly where Casey is. Around 12 o'clock is where Davis is, and around just a fraction to the left of where Davis is Mawson. And another thing that I must point out is that when Sir Douglas Mawson went south and undertook his enormous trek around much of Antarctica, it was at about 2:30 or 2 o'clock in that smaller section of the Australian Antarctic Territory. Mawson Station is about as far away from where Mawson went as you could get while still remaining in the Australian Antarctic Territory. Now, I'll be saying a little bit more about this map later on, and particularly its political significance. But Australia's interest, and Tasmania's interest particularly in the south, took a long time to get going. And it wasn't really until the Americans started saying, well, there's all sorts of seal oil, elephant seal oil. This is Neil the seal, he's the elephant seal. It wasn't until elephant seal oil started to become useful that Tasmanians started getting interested in it. They had been interested in sealing in the Bass Strait, and in fact even over as far as Kangaroo Island. But going south was something that early Tasmanians and early Australians did not want to do. And a theory has been put forward, and we could discuss it on another occasion, that actually the early Australian settlers really hated the ocean. They'd spent 3 months or 4 months locked in the hold of a ship, and when they finally arrived, wherever it was they arrived, they got onto dry land and they said, that's it, I'm never going back to sea again. So starting with the view that Tasmanians were never really maritime-oriented people, it took until the Americans were operating on a place called Heard Island, which is not on this map, but way out to 9 o'clock from where you're looking. Imagine a map of the world and draw a line at 45 degrees down from Perth and another one down from Durban in South Africa, and where those two meet, that's Heard Island. The Americans got there, the Americans exploited it, and this is a drawing of a sealing camp where oil would have been taken. When the earliest exploitation of the South started, from Tasmania's point of view, it was a New Zealander who did it, a man called Joseph Hatch. And here is the advertisement for Hatch's harness oil. I love if you can read upside down and back to front, where he's saying, get your neighbours to write in and send 2 and 3pence, and I'll send them a little sample box of the oil and the wax, which you can use for your harnesses and your saddles and all these other things. However, he was a New Zealander. What happened then, as far as Tasmanians were concerned, was that in about 1840, so we've come a long way from early settlement, in about 1840, they started whaling, and they started whaling in the Southern Ocean. Up until then, places like Tinderbox and Droughtie's Point had seen quite a bit of bay whaling, where you went out in a small boat, you harpooned your whale, and you rowed like mad, and you got it back to the shore, and you slaughtered it on the shore, and you rendered down the oil on the shore. But in 1840, the Americans were already coming and visiting Hobart in their ships, which were designed to catch whales at sea, render the oil down at sea, and arrive back with oil nicely stored in barrels. 1840, the local population started to look up to that sort of thing, took an interest in it, and here was the sort of a painting of the sort of thing that happened in the 1840s, 50s, in fact, all the way until about 1900. This picture, a bit fanciful, shows a sperm whale either being attacked by this boat or about to destroy this boat, we don't know which. A factual error here is that there were usually, or indeed always, 5 rowers, and there was a steersman at the back and a harpoonist at the front, so the artist missed out one of the people. In the background is the whaling ship, and there's a whale alongside that's having sheets of blubber sloughed off it like peeling an orange. And if you do it correctly, you can get all the peel of the orange off in one piece. And that's what many of these ships did. They then rendered it down, hence all the black smoke. So this was the sort of ocean whaling which Tasmanians from about 1840 said, we need to get involved in this and make some money. It's reported that on Good Friday in 1847, that was a while ago, but 1847, there were 45 ships, whaling ships, in port here in Hobart, of which 26 were foreign and 29 were Tasmanian whalers. And in the 70 years from 1830 on until 1900, there were about 13 or 14 whaling expeditions every year from the port of Hobart. So Hobart became the whaling capital of the Southern Hemisphere. We actually don't say much about that now, and if you go up to the Melbourne Town Hall in Swanston Street and look at the ground rather than look at the building, which they would want you to do, you'll see there are little brass roundels in the pavement. Next time you're there, have a look. And one of them is about the whaling industry out of Melbourne. Well, if Melbourne caught one whale, they were doing well. And yet here we are, the whaling capital, and we pay no attention to it at all, except for the fact that we have a whaling ship on Hobart's coat of arms. I wonder if you knew that. Where would you go to look at Hobart coat of arms? Go into the town hall as if to walk up the stairs to the big ballroom, and on the left is a facsimile of the coat of arms, and you'll see a whaling ship on the top, sitting on top of the armorial bearings. Anyhow, we really, Tasmanians have really turned their back on the ocean and didn't really get much involved until the era of scientific observation started. This was the great era of Antarctic exploration, and think of Shackleton, think of Scott, think of Amundsen, think of all the other great explorers that went south. Of course, there was a political message to all of this, and it was that the Russians were going to close the strait between South America and the tip of Antarctica, and the Russians couldn't be allowed to do that. So, in fact, what happened was that Britain just marched in and said, we're going to claim the whole of Antarctica. Ba-boom, done. And we'll do it by letters patent. We won't do it through any diplomatic a process, and from then the whole of Antarctica was under British control. Quite important, because eventually they got a bit tired of the whole of it and they started giving away bits to their friends, notably Australia and New Zealand. I don't even know if the French would come in. Sorry, Camille, but I don't think that the French were seen as being friends in those days. So the first visitor, and I've got no photograph of this, but the first visitor to Tasmania was Dumont d'Urville. Does that name mean anything to any of you? Dumont d'Urville was a great French explorer, and he established the French, he put the French flag in Terre Adélie, in Adélie land in France, and he visited here in a ship called l'Astrolabe, the l'Astrolabe. The little ship we have today that comes in for the French is still called l'Astrolabe, and they spent some time here in 1840 on their way through to Antarctica. But the next visitor to us was much more important. It was the two ships called the Erebus and the Terror. Now, I hope those names mean something to you. Michael Palin has written a beautiful book called Erebus, and it's well worth reading if you haven't read it. Michael Palin did some of that research for the book here at the Maritime Museum. Erebus was commanded by Captain James Clark Ross, after whom the Ross Sea is named, and the Terror was captained by Francis Crozier, and it was said that Lady Jane Franklin had an affair with Francis Crozier. I'm just telling you what the newspapers were saying. You could work the rest out for yourself. Now, they came to Hobart in 1840 to set up this little shed here, which was a magnetic observatory, and the site was where Government House now sits. It didn't have any other building on it then, and that was rather important because the observatory had to be built only of wood. It could have no metal in it, and they were trying to observe changes in the Earth's magnetic field at the start of a long period where magnetometry was a really important thing, and in a curious way that I'll tell you in a minute, magnetometry is hugely important politically and historically to us here in Tasmania. Well, Erebus and Terror were here for 2 or 3 weeks, and they had a whale of a time. The crews were looked after royally by the government, by the people, and they pushed off and they did all their work down in the Antarctic, and indeed they claimed Antarctica in the name of Queen Victoria at a place called Possession Island. Well, that was about 1840. Nothing happened then for a few years. But all the time, during those few years, the Americans were making a lot of money out of oil. And nobody got interested in that in Tasmania until William Crowther, love him or loathe him, until William Crowther said, there's money to be made here. I'm going to send a ship down to Heard Island. So 1853, the ship called the Offley went south to Heard Island in order to make a fortune. At least that was the idea. He took with him, he wasn't aboard, it was a Captain James Robinson that was on board. He took a tender ship called the Elizabeth Jane. They set off together, but the crew of the Elizabeth Jane thought it was getting colder and colder and a lot too unpleasant, so they simply hijacked themselves to Mauritius, where the climate was much better and they enjoyed themselves in Mauritius. But poor old Offley was without its tender, and that created all sorts of difficulties. The ship finally limped back to Hobart 2 or 3 years later with only 250 barrels of oil, hardly worth the effort. Crowther thought it was a good experiment to be involved in. Significantly, one of the things that he brought back with him was a young elephant seal, a live elephant seal, which was displayed on the grounds where we are right now. History doesn't really relate for how long it lived, but it didn't live for a very long time. And that's the last time, to my knowledge, until Neil the seal came along, that a live elephant seal has been seen by any Tasmanians. Well, the first exploratory ship, the first ship of that big international Antarctic exploratory era, was the SS Antarctic in 1903. And it went on a Swedish-Norwegian voyage funded by Niels Nordenskjöld, and it went south just to examine what it could in Antarctica. It left Hobart in 1894, so we're getting very close to modern times. So you see that all the early part of our southern horizon, we weren't really very interested in it. But as the end of the 19th century approached and early 20th century, interest heated up enormously. A Norwegian named Henrik Bull, who worked in an insurance office in Melbourne, but he was a Norwegian. He really wanted to get in on the whaling act, so he obtained a ship which he named the Southern Cross. But actually, this was, for those of you who know a little bit about Arctic and Antarctic exploration, this was the Fram that Nansen had taken both into the Arctic and the Antarctic, and which Amundsen then brought here to Hobart, and which sat off the shore at Taroona, and the dogs barking on board all night kept the good citizens of Taroona awake all night. He anchored it out there because he didn't want the ship to tie up alongside until he had told King Haakon that yes, he had discovered the South Pole. Once he did that, the ship came along shore and all was well. Anyway, this was the ship renamed the Southern Cross, and it was the expedition was run by a captain, by a man called Borchgrevink, another Norwegian. The Norwegians had the complete hold over Antarctic knowledge in those days. But this is an interesting expedition from one point of view, and that is that it took on board the first Tasmanian ever to go to Antarctica, Louis Benaki. Benaki, his first name, Louis, is represented by Louisville up on the east coast. His father rented Maria Island, and you probably know more about him than I do. He got lots of money out of the government to develop things, and he was a bit of a charlatan. He tied bunches of grapes to vines which didn't want to grow, so when the inspectors came, he took them quickly along, and here were all these lovely bunches of grapes. Anyway, all of that apart, Louis, his son, studied magnetometry at the University of Melbourne, and was the first Australian to overwinter at Cape Adare. Maybe I should have pointed that out on the map, but when I said to you, Tasmania started its journey on that sort of rather thick red knobbly bit that stuck out, that's exactly where Cape Adare is. He didn't intend to overwinter, but Borchgrevink's expedition ran into all sorts of difficulties and they were forced to overwinter, a thing which in 1903 would not have been a nice experience. Anyway, that was Louis Benaki. I don't think we make enough of him in Tasmania, although here he is standing down on the docks. Not a very good likeness of him, I have to say, from the photographs I've seen, but at least we do have a little somewhat whimsical statuette of Louis Benaki. So that was the very early days of the 20th century. A little later, in about 2011, we had the steam yacht Aurora, the very famous yacht that took Sir Douglas Mawson, he wasn't Sir Douglas Mawson then, down to Antarctica to look at the possibilities of Antarctica being of some use to the new young country of Australia. He set out on the Australian Antarctic Expedition, it was called the Australian Antarctic Expedition, with the ship returning a year later without him, and maybe you know the story. He had a lot of trouble. He was down at Commonwealth Bay, that was the bit near where the French were, nowhere near where Mawson Station is. He had a lot of trouble there and he actually missed the ship coming home. He was stuck away out in the bush, as it were, and he had a terrible walk home. His two colleagues died and he had to kill all the dogs, and he was suffering from liver problems because eating dog meat is not, the meat of dogs is not particularly good for your liver. And he nearly froze to death, and he lost his supply, his resupply cans. He finally made it back to the little hut at Commonwealth Bay, the reproduction of which is sitting along just beside the Maritime Museum. He finally made it back there, but the ship had already gone. Radio contact was just about possible when the weather was in the right mood. From there, from Commonwealth Bay up to Macquarie Island, where there was a radio mast. The remains of it are still there today, and then it could be relayed from there up to Hobart. So he was forced then to spend another winter on Macquarie Island. A couple of his crew members had stayed behind, and this ship then came up to Hobart early 1912, did some other bits and pieces, and then went back in late 1912 to fetch him, which it did. And he arrived back here in December of 2013. You probably know his book, The Home of the Blizzard. There are some exquisite passages in it. Some of them turn your stomach, like the one when he was stuck out away from his camp and he realized he hadn't taken his socks off for 3 weeks. He had 6 pairs of socks on. So he unpeeled his socks in his little tent. And then he found that the hard layer of skin under his foot had come away from the rest of his foot. And in the text he says, what do I do about this? So he said, I just put it back together again and put my socks back on, and we carried on. You know, that's what you did. It's a fantastic book. It's an excellent read. So that was about 1912. One of his crew members was Shackleton. And in 1914, Shackleton took this ship to be part of what was called the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. And you will know of it from the fact that the other ship which was involved was called the Endurance. And the Endurance was the one that got crushed in the ice and gradually sank. And all the crew had to spend the winter on a place called Elephant Island, just off the Antarctic Peninsula. They all survived, and Shackleton and a few of his crew rowed all the way to South Georgia, and eventually they were all collected in one of the most amazing Antarctic survival stories. That same Shackleton, incidentally, for any of you who have been on any Antarctic cruises down the peninsula, you would know he was buried at a place called Grytviken, which was a whaling station on South Georgia. And the tradition is that you go there on a boat with a glass of whiskey, you drink half of it, and you pour the rest on his grave. And that's been the tradition. His grave must be absolutely pickled to all, just amazingly. However, in that Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, this ship was to go down to the Ross Sea, which I pointed out on the map. It was then the crew were then to establish a base of resources, food and other materials at a place where the Endurance crew would have been walking over Antarctica, over the South Pole, South Geographic Pole, and they would then come to this spot at 83 degrees south and then get their new victuals. But of course that never happened because the Endurance sank and the whole thing was a bit of a disaster. The poor old Aurora finally made it back to New Zealand, much in need of a dry dock, and it spent a fair bit of time having a lot of work done to it. But I want to go back now to the Norwegians, because they're central to our story, and particularly to this man, Carl Anton Larsen. He was a very famous navigator. He was a personal friend of Amundsen. You can see from the stamp, the British stamp at the top, from the South Sandwich Islands. Well, that's now what we call South Georgia, or South Georgia was part of the South Sandwich Island. He went there in a ship called the Jason in 1894. With another, he was extremely experienced. He had been to Macquarie Island a number of times. He had been to a whole range of Antarctic places. He was the first person ever to describe the emperor penguin. After him is named the Larsen Ice Shelf on the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula. Alas, it collapsed about 18 years ago. Jason Island, just to the north, is named after his ship. He was the first person ever to collect a fossil from Antarctica, from Seymour Island, which is on the west side of the peninsula. So he was a very big name in Antarctic exploration and Antarctic science. He went south in 1901, not in this ship, but in the Antarctic, the one that Nordenskjöld had earlier, very proven Antarctic ship. He went south to take a scientific expedition to Grahamland, to that northern part of the Antarctic territory. But one thing after another happened. He lost his ship, was crushed in the ice, and he and the crew had to build a hut on a little island called Paulet Island. And the remains of it are still there to this day. The red staining is courtesy of penguins. If any of you have had experience of penguins, you'll know that the colour of penguins is not black and white at all. It's red. And I hope that many of you will come to the lovely new exhibition which is opening in the Maritime Museum on Friday. Lovely Antarctic photographs, all in black and white, so you won't see the red. So you have to see the red now. Penguin poo is red, bright red in colour, and I can smell it every time I look at it. I can smell it from here. Highly evocative, not hugely unpleasant, but very evocative. Anyway, Paulet Island and this little hut had to look after the crew, Captain Larsen and his crew, and he was eventually, a couple of years later, they spent a year and a half living just on penguins. They were eventually picked up by an Argentinian vessel, confusingly with the name Uruguay. So the ship called Uruguay was an Argentinian vessel that picked them up and took them to Buenos Aires. And the crew were more than happy to jump on the next ship and get back to Britain, but not Larsen. Larsen thought there's money to be made from hunting whales in the Southern Ocean. And the Argentinians have got money and they've got a huge fishing industry. So he stayed on in Buenos Aires and he managed to raise money from a whole bunch of Argentinian institutions, and he founded the Compañía Argentina de Pesca, the Argentinian fishing company, expressly to go after Antarctic whales, and he established his site at Grytviken. That is the little place where Shackleton's grave is now humming. And he ran that station, he built it, and he ran it for nearly 20 years, made a lot of money. But as a good Norwegian, he thought, okay, well, this place is now British. Maybe me and my family should become British. So they did. They all took out British nationality. But he wasn't interested in Britain, really. He wanted to push off back to Norway, to whatever sort of life a retired Norwegian sea captain, whaler, expeditioner, explorer would do. So in 1922, off he went to build a little farm or something outside Oslo where he lived. But the sea was never far away, and nor was whaling. And his old friend, Amundsen, persuaded him that there was money to be made in Antarctic whaling. Now, this is a picture of the statue of Amundsen that you'll see outside the IMAS building. I love it because it's a picture of Amundsen when Amundsen was absolutely at the peak of excitement about something. He was absolutely enjoying life, wasn't he? I've looked at lots of pictures of Amundsen and they all look even more gloomy than this one. So he clearly was an interesting man, even though he did spend a night, didn't he, in Hadley's Hotel, or more than a night in Hadley's Hotel. Anyway, Amundsen was the king of the Antarctic. He and Larsen got together, and Amundsen said, if you're going to go whaling in the Southern Ocean, take my advice and make your base Hobart. Because the workers in Hobart are excellent, they have a huge work ethic, and they know what they're doing, they've got a long history of whaling, they are the best people. Don't go to South Africa, don't go to New Zealand, go to Hobart. So that's what he did. Larsen then founded a company and bought a ship to go whaling in, which he very diplomatically named the Sir James Clark Ross, the well-established British explorer. Remember, Larsen had taken British nationality. And so he took this old freighter called the Mahondra, it had been built for the Indian route, and renamed it the James Clark Ross. It was a huge ship with a massive coal reserve, enough to be able to get him all the way from Hobart to Antarctica, to the Ross Sea, and spend time there whaling and get back. At least mostly they got back. Sometimes they needed to burn everything on board which would burn in order to get back. But when he came to Hobart, 1923, this ship sailed into the Derwent, November 1923. The local people didn't know what it was. This huge, big black ship, followed by 5 little ships, which had guns mounted on the front. They had never seen anything like it. But this was the first whaling expedition to operate out of Hobart. And the little catchers were called the Star Catchers because he had bought the Star Whaling Company in America and had 5 little oil-fired, not coal-fired, whale catchers. And this is a rather fanciful painting by a Dutchman called Willem van der Does, who was on that very first expedition and later became a very famous Dutch maritime artist, spending a lot of his life in Indonesia and chronicling all the fishing vessels there. But he was on this expedition, and this was one of his paintings, of a little steamer away out in the pack ice. And remember, there was hardly any radio contact possible in 1923. It rapidly came on after that, but in that early year, there was nothing to be, there was no contact. And if it went away, and you had no contact. This is to me, a very, very interesting picture, an enormously sad picture, because if you count very carefully, there are 16 blue whales in this picture. And I defy you to find anybody living today who has ever seen 16 blue whales. I've never seen a blue whale. I've seen sei and minke and other Antarctic whales, but never seen a blue whale. Because what Larsen did was to start this era of industrial slaughter of the Southern Ocean. And today we've got a tiny sliver of the blue whale population. It is increasing, and perhaps by the end of the century, it might be back to something like half of what it was in 1923. But that what Larsen did, with the best intentions, it has to be said, was to cause a massive decline in the largest species of mammals the world's ever seen. So here are 16 blue whales, all having been brought in alongside the James Clark Ross. And at the top left there, you'll see two guys in a little boat. They were the flensers. Their job was to cut the blubber off, and it was then hauled up onto the deck, where it was then tried out. One individual sheet of blubber could render down 30 barrels of oil. That was a lot of oil. That was just one sheet. You'd get more than that off a blue whale. This is just from the neck area. Those folds are to enable the skin to be able to expand massively when it opens its mouth to take in a whole swarm of krill, and then it closes up again and the water is shot out through those baleen strips that these whales have. So 30 barrels of oil would have come from just one piece like that. Now, in 1923, when Larsen first came, he was feted here in Hobart. The state government and the Hobart ports gave him a wonderful reception, and he said, "Look, I really want to charter Macquarie Island. I want a lease on Macquarie Island." And here is the island. The current Antarctic or subantarctic station is right at the top there on that little skinny bit, and that's where Larsen wanted to build a whaling station so he could keep his small catchers there over the winter. So he said to the state government, "Can I please have a lease?" And the state government sort of blew a bit hot and cold originally. The newspaper in November 23, the Mercury, said, let me quote, "In all probability, Larsen will decide to make Hobart one of his principal ports, provided he can get a satisfactory lease on Macquarie Island for whaling purposes." Captain Larsen hoped that the city council, that the ports authorities and the state government would help him and be so kind as to help him to fix up a lease in respect of Macquarie Island. The newspaper then goes on, "Of course, a lease was one thing and a good lease another," brackets laughter. So the gentlemen who ran Hobart's port were yes, let's have a good lease, yes. That interest went on, and a month later, they were still talking about the fact that a draft lease had been given to Larsen, and Larsen was now in correspondence with the consul. There wasn't a consul in Hobart, there was just a temporary consul. He was in correspondence with the consul in Melbourne about what the lease was saying. When he returned from the Ross Sea, Larsen returned on his first ever voyage, April 1924, he came not back to Hobart, but he came to Port Chalmers in New Zealand, near Dunedin. And that was to satisfy the requirement that now that sector of the Ross Sea had been given to New Zealand. So he went there. but it turns out he had already abandoned the idea of a lease because of three conditions which the state government would not give way on. The first was that he wouldn't be granted a lease over the whole island. Tasmania wanted to keep its powder dry and maybe have several companies there all bringing in money, so wouldn't give him a lease over the whole island, and he wanted a lease on the whole island. Secondly, the Tasmanian government said, we'll only give you 6 months notice when we want rid of you. And this is primarily because the New Zealander, Joseph Hatch, they hadn't been able to get rid of him for ages. And he didn't even manage to make enough money to pay the £20 a year rent for the island. And the third thing was that the Commonwealth government wouldn't allow him to bring any of the equipment that he needed for his whaling station without paying customs duty on it. And frankly, he said, I'm not having that. In his correspondence, you can't read this, and I'm not expecting you to do so unless you're fluent in Norwegian and can read Old Norwegian script, but here is Larsen's letter. You might just be able to make out at the top that it's to the Norwegian consul in Melbourne. Let me read you just a little bit. He said, as they, the Tasmanian government, believed that the Commonwealth government could not interfere in the custom question, I let the matter drop and declared that without those things the licence was worthless to me. I used the expression that I did not want to risk putting my head in the lion's mouth. To laugh at this and replied, you're right, Captain. Now I'm going south without a licence this first year and have set forces in motion through men not in the government, but from various positions that have a lot to say in the government. Interestingly, for those of you who know anything about Macquarie Island and its history and Tasmania's involvement with it, the number one reference is a book called Compston's book on Macquarie Island. It's a big, thick book. It says absolutely nothing about the lease, nothing about how Larsen was going to operate on the island. He goes on to say here that he would be putting reindeer on the island, and indeed he could have a little factory to harvest penguin eggs. And in fact, Douglas Mawson must have got involved in this discussion from the Commonwealth point of view, because Mawson had not long before addressed the Royal Society of Tasmania, in whose room we are now, to say that Macquarie Island really ought to become a nature reserve. It did subsequently, that was about 1926, he had that lecture. In 1933 it did become a nature reserve, but Mawson then was very much involved in wanting to see whaling happen. Great conservationist, he wanted Macquarie Island to be kept as a reserve, but he was saying, why aren't Tasmanians out there in the Southern Ocean hammering whales? The stocks are inexhaustible. This was Mr. Hatch and one of his digesters at Lusitania Bay, 700,000 penguins a year. 700,000 penguins a year went into the digester. Mostly king penguins, as these are, but really anything that walked or tried to fly would finish up in there, and a lot of elephant seals. So Mawson may have been involved in assessing this lease, and why the lease has never been found, I do not know, except that there was skullduggery going on between the young state of Tasmania and Victoria, and well, the rest of Australia really, the Commonwealth, who actually didn't think that maritime issues were of any interest to Tasmania, and they wanted Tasmania to just push off and not bother them about things like the Lighthouse Act and about the Navigation Act. All of that was finally resolved, but my view is that the lease was kept quiet so that subsequent discussions with the Commonwealth government weren't going to be blown off course. Anyway, poor old Larsen, for his sins, managed to build a location at Kaipipi base on Stewart Island in New Zealand, and in fact this picture is only from the 1950s. There's still a lot of it that you can see there. Well, Larsen had been south 23 to 24. He had learned a lot about whaling. He had learned that his was the first steel-hulled ship to go south. He had learned that a steel-hulled ship could withstand ice pressures. And so he made some developments, And he came back in 1925 with a new flensing deck. He'd learned a lot about how to cut whales up when you're in the Southern Ocean. He almost didn't come in 1925 because after he'd left Europe, he heard that the Commonwealth government was going to charge him for passing the light, the iron pot light. And it was going to be something like $10,000 or $15,000 worth at today's money. And then he was going to have to pay another $10,000 in today's money for port dues. And he was furious. He was spitting chips at the duplicity of the Australian government. So he said he would just anchor in the river. And could the honorary consul please bring the young men out on board? And that if he put them in a tug, it shouldn't be more than 50 or 60 pounds in those days. And that's actually what happened. He visited for 6 hours only, anchored out in the waters out there, and turned around and headed out to sea, never to come back to Australia. Australia had scored its own best own goal. Here was the beginning of a new industry that would have brought a lot of money into Tasmania. And now he had gone. He was going to operate out of New Zealand. I showed you Kaipipi. That's where he operated out of. In fact, he didn't, because 8 days after he left Tasmania, he died on board of a heart attack. And they kept him on board, carried on with the voyage, which was quite successful, got back to New Zealand, and then they transferred him back to Norway, and he's buried not far from Oslo. But as luck would have it, another Norwegian whaling company stepped into the breach and said, blow all this malarkey about state ownerships. We're going to catch whales in international waters. We don't want to be involved in New Zealand waters or in any other small concern. We don't want anything to do with that. We want to operate only in international waters. And so it did. And for 8 or 9 years, the Nielsen Alonso, with its 5 catchers, were regular here in Hobart, and they took on a crew of 25 or 30 young men year after year. They left their little catchers on the domain, and here they are from a painting by Marchant in 1930, so they were left over winter, with a few crew to look after them, and they got on very well with the local people. It was altogether a good thing. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, 1930, Mawson was once again proclaiming Antarctica in the name of the then king on his famous Banzari expedition, British Australian New Zealand Antarctic Research Expedition, the famous Banzari expedition with a huge scientific report that's still being analysed to this day. Mawson's number 3 from the right there. So this, and they put the proclamation in a copper canister, which you can see strapped to the flag. Later recovered and is in the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge. Well, at about this time, and I go back to the slide that I started with, at about this time the Australian government had been given the huge sector of Antarctica which we know today as the Australian Antarctic Territory. And in order to establish the significance of that, the Australian government published this map, which was the most up-to-date map that had ever been published. And they sent copies to every Australian commission around the world to establish the fact that Australia was here and was going to stay. As I said earlier, you'll see that the Terre Adélie is the only other claim to Antarctica that had been recognised by then, and Australia was happy to keep it as a claim. And indeed, the relationship between France and Australia in Antarctic matters is incredibly close. You may be aware of the Cornelian Bay French memorial, and every time there's any accident in Antarctica, in the French program, they come through Hobart, and there's a ceremony down there, and another name, alas, is added to an extraordinarily long list of names. So that relationship was going really well, but that was the only one that had got to the point of saying, well, we recognize the territorial claim of other countries. And now, of course, there are 9 claimants, and there are lots of wannabes, I can tell you. Well, Australia then got going with an Antarctic program, and in 1956 coming quite up to date. Top left-hand corner with an old tank landing craft, the HMAS Libanon. We have the bell of it in the Maritime Museum here. Was the first trip south to establish both Mawson Station and revisit Macquarie Island. Of course, Mawson had been at Macquarie to build his radio tower, but there was no station there. So at the same time, they used a ship called the Wyatt Earp. Now, whoever would name their ship Wyatt Earp other than American, I don't know, but it was an American ship, a hopeless ship. It would slither around on wet grass, they said. And on that first expedition, 1947, when it was used in 1947, it couldn't even get close enough to the ice to let people off. Australia then got in line with a lot of the Dan ships, the Kista Dan up here, which actually built Mawson Station. Everything that you can see there, I was going to say everything you see there today came off Kista Dan, but everything you could see at Mawson came off Kista Dan. And then there was the Magadan, and then there was the Tala Dan, and there was the Nella Dan. I'll say a little about that. And then there was the Aurora Australis here, which we, of course, had as our beloved ship for 20 plus years. Now we've got the Noina, and here's another shot of the Noina. And if you've got close eyes there, you'll see Chris, me, and Ron Gifford, just as we were about to have a tour around the ship. And the Noina is now Australia's national ship. Nobody's yet been able to look around it because of the ports nonsense. When that day will come, I don't know. The most famous of the Dan ships, of course, was the Nella Dan. And for 30 odd years, it kept Australia's Antarctic program running until Christmas Eve in, which year was it? 1987, thank you, Christmas Eve 1987. It hit a rock coming into Buckles Bay, or it drifted its anchor and bashed into a rock, and you can see it's in a pretty sorry state. Everyone got off, of course. There was no loss of life or anything, and eventually it was then towed a bit to the north of Macquarie Island and scuttled. It was a ship that really set Antarctic science going because you could do marine science for the first time. This was the first time that the Southern Ocean became important, and it became important because the world needed more fish. And as you know, we have the CAMLAR headquarters in Macquarie Street, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Australia has signed up to lots of international conventions, but there's only one that's headquartered in Australia, and that's CAMLAR and Macquarie Street. So give it another look next time you pass. Things went on by ship until really very recently, until 2004, 2005, when Australia had a lot of money. The minerals boom was doing really well, and John Howard agreed that we should have an air transport system. This was the first flight. If I had a pointer, I would point to the bald-headed man right at the front, who was the minister. And the minister then was Peter Garrett, who you will know from Midnight Oils. And if you've got good eyes, you'll see a much younger version of myself standing just to his right. I look to have a white tick on my shoulder. And right at the moment the photograph was taken, the minister insisted everybody took their hats off. That was fantastic for him. He must have frozen to death in a moment. It was minus 17 when that picture was taken. And here is the Australian aircraft, a modified Airbus A320, it was a 319 actually, which had a massive fuel tank in place of half the hold. So it can get down to Antarctica, find the weather is too bad, turn around and come back to Hobart. In fact, it could get as far as Brisbane without having to land. So we now can get to Antarctica in 4 hours. You can leave Hobart at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and arrive in Antarctica about 8, and that's the way the flights are timed, to arrive at the coldest part of the day in Antarctica, because there's a tendency for this airstrip, which is just a compacted snow one, to melt. And if it's melted, then the aircraft wants to slip. But Wilkins Airfield is the longest airfield in the Commonwealth. It's 4.5 kilometres long. So actually the aircraft has got a lot of time to slow down. Well, that brings us absolutely up to date. The Australian government has got a number of really clearly articulated wishes and desires and objectives for the southern region. One is to maintain Antarctica's freedom from strategic and political confrontation. So far, fingers crossed, so good. The second is preserve Australian sovereignty over the AAT, the Australian Antarctic Territory, including sovereign rights over the adjacent offshore areas. Important for fishing, not important for whaling, because whaling doesn't occur anymore. Not important for mineral exploration, because there's a treaty now to ban minerals. Australia is all for supporting a strong and effective Antarctic treaty system, an amazingly successful system that is successful because it was written by scientists. To conduct world-class scientific research consistent with national priorities, which the country does, to protect the Antarctic environment, having regard to its special qualities and its effects on our region. All our weather comes from there, as you noticed this morning when you opened your back door. To be informed about and able to influence developments in a region geographically close to Australia. And this is something that Australia does remarkably well. It is hugely influential in the Antarctic Treaty. Why? Because on the one hand, there's Britain, who of course owns it all and knows everything, and that's that. And on the other side, you've got America, who of course knows everything and has claimed the very center of Antarctica and knows everything, and partly a bit to the Russians, who also know everything. And in the middle of this sits little old Australia, able to sort out diplomatic disaster out of diplomatic disaster. Had we a lot of time, I'd like to tell you about how I was a group from the Australian delegation that managed to get the Indians to build their new station in a place which wasn't biologically sensitive. It took us about 3 days of non-stop, lots of Indian meals, lots of cups of tea. We, in fact, as a group, we tried to say, well, let's practice what's called bladder diplomacy. Let's just keep giving them tea and keep talking to them. We got our way at the end. And finally, to foster the economic opportunities as arising in Antarctica, but that are consistent with the treaty. And that, of course, is fish. And it's enormously important to us here that we have a well-organized, regulated Southern Ocean fishery. Alas, if any of you are taking krill oil capsules, it's supposed to be good for arthritis, but I'm not sure about that, just bear in mind that the krill fishery is now being overexploited like never before. The Chinese have 3 or 4 vessels which literally vacuum in shoals of krill, millions at a time, and squeeze the oil out of them. The Norwegians do as well, and the Russians are building such a ship, and very soon we're going to run out of krill. When we run out of krill, of course, blue whales will run out of krill, everything else will run out of krill, crab-eater seals will run out of krill, penguins, blah, 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 the whole story downward. The exhibition we're putting on in the Maritime Museum is called Antarctica is Melting. Well, it's melting in more ways than just one. This is a horrible one. So, turning to Tasmania, and I'm literally finished here, there are some worrying signs, but there's also some hopeful signs. Noina is not allowed under the bridge to go and collect oil, as you know. It has to go up to Burnie. Now, this is a ship which can maintain its position to within 50 millimeters, 5 centimeters, in a howling Southern Ocean gale. And yet it's not allowed to go under the bridge for fear of being blown meters to one side or the other and knock the bridge down. As the Americans would say, go figure. The government says it's working on a solution. Indeed, the Tasmanian government was given a grant to fix up the wharf by the Commonwealth government on condition that they fixed the problem of getting oil to Noina, to the wharf there, and that had to be done by the 31st of July, which was 2 days ago, and there still is no solution. The Noina still has to, and for the next season will have to go up to the northwest of the state to Burnie to pick up oil at a cost of about $1.75 million a year. And as the former chief scientist, I would say, I know where that money comes from. It comes from the science budget. because you can't cut back on the amount of fuel you send down to the station, or the number of doctors you have, or whether there's enough fuel for the winter or food for the winter. You can't cut down on that. All you can do is to say, oh, well, we'll just chop off a bit of science. And that's what's happening. Alas, there's no suitable wharf yet for the icebreaker. Mind you, there's no suitable wharf for our ferries with connection to the mainland, but there's no suitable wharf. There's no Antarctic museum. This is the place in Australia where there should be an Antarctic museum, but because it's a Commonwealth program and not a state program, the Commonwealth says the museum is the National Museum in Canberra, where it's responsible for I don't know how many other Australian issues, Antarctica being just one. There's an exhibition on right now, but there should be a museum here, and a museum was being planned, and then along came the football stadium. It was going to be right there. And now we don't own up to the fact that we have anything to do with Antarctica. We kind of say we're a gateway, an Antarctic gateway, but where would any visitor to Hobart see that? Not at the airport, not coming in on the road where you have that sign opposite the gasworks that speaks about sister cities in Japan and goodness knows what. We have no promotion of Antarctic credentials. A couple of years ago, or was it only 1 year ago, when Tanya Plibersik was the minister, she nearly gave the whole Antarctic program away to Albany. Albany is about 11 kilometers closer to Antarctica than we are. She backed off from that, and thankfully nothing has happened, and the current minister, Murray Watt, is much more interested in keeping the program here. For now, we're safe. But as far as the future is concerned, I'm not holding my breath. Thank you very much.
When was your first trip to the Antarctic?
Mine?
Yes.
It was 1999. The Aurora had caught fire. The Aurora had caught fire at the very end of 98, nearly a disaster because people had to spend some days on the ice. They hadn't been trained for that. And the ship then went south in February of 99, having been repaired in Fremantle. I went over to Fremantle and joined it there, and we had to go around all the stations to pick up people who had a terrible time not knowing if they were ever going to get back or when. So that was it.
How many people all are on the Antarctic from Australia?
During the winter time, right now, it would be about 25 at each of the 3 stations and about the same number on Macquarie. So less than 100 all up. In the middle of summer at Davis Station, you might have 250 people. I know I've washed up for them, and you take all day washing up. The kitchen slushy is the hardest work I think I've ever done. So it can be up to 250. That would be a lot. At most stations, it would be around 100, 150. It's a lot of people coming in and out by aircraft and coming in and out on ships going from one station to another.
You mentioned you're not being able to go through the bridge. Out of interest, in the paper this morning, the climate guide contributed to it. One of the tankers going up to the point is 20 odd feet or something wider.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of politics in this. Don't really know the answer to it. There have been all sorts of suggestions that fuel should be brought in road tankers. Well, I mean, the Noina takes on millions of litres. It's a well-designed ship because the ship runs on the same fuel, the special Antarctic blend, that the stations are designed to run on. So it can take on an enormous amount of fuel and then pump out this much for Mawson and that much for Davis and still have enough to run on. It would take every tanker in Tasmania probably about 6 months to fill her up. It's highly political, and I can but hope that issue is resolved soon. But I don't see any real move on behalf of the state government, which wants the credit of the Antarctic program, but is not prepared to do anything about it. Sad. think it's lunchtime.
Thanks, Michael.
My pleasure. So now,
Take that microphone.
oh yes, I noticed in here there's a little.
Oh, I actually lost one of these. Yeah, perfect.
That's what it was.
Right, thank you. So the rain stopped. Thank you.